Hello, I'm David Wu. Welcome to the Money Game, where we make actionable predictions about the big stories shaping the world today. If you're interested in making money, you're in the right place. If you're not, this program is designed for anyone who just wants to learn about what makes our world tick. COVID finally caught up with me, well, at least I think it did. I would know for sure in 2 days once my PCR test results are back, but I've got all the symptoms. I've been coughing, especially like a madman. I literally thought about basically canceling the show, but given this is such a new blog, I thought the show must go on. But you will be deprived of an energetic David Wu. I'm going to keep going until I lose my voice completely. But as you know how I feel about 2022, I've been saying for weeks now, I think there are going to be three themes that I think will define what 2022 is going to be about. Number one, I believe that Omicron is going to spell the end game for COVID. Number two, I think the fight to tame inflation is going to be much uglier than the market thinks, especially in the US. And number three, I think there's a real rising probability of geopolitical risk in generally boiling over, and that does not bode well. So let's talk about these things, because I wanted today basically show you three numbers that have come to encapsulate these three themes for me this week. The first number I want to talk about is the number 2. 2 is the number of countries among G20 countries that has seen a peaking of COVID. That is, this week, UK has now joined South Africa as the second G20 countries where COVID appears to have peaked. As you can see here on this chart, that in the UK, the number of new cases has dropped by almost basically 40% from the peak a few weeks ago. So South Africa and now the UK have overcome this latest wave of COVID, most likely driven by Omicron, despite the fact that the number of new cases worldwide has now basically reached a new pandemic high. When I woke up this morning, I was suddenly seized by this need to know exactly how long it took before Omicron peaked in the UK versus South Africa. So I took out my calendar and my calculator, and guess what? When I look at how many days had elapsed between the first patient was discovered and when the 7-day moving average of the new confirmed cases peaked in both countries, 39 days. I was almost floored when I saw. I thought I must have made a mistake, but guess what? 39 days. What a discovery. So happens that I know the UK and South Africa fairly well. I lived in the UK for 10 years. I'm a UK citizen. South Africa was actually my first professional assignment. I love South Africa. And let me tell you, no two countries could be quite as different as the UK and South Africa. Just think about this. The vaccination rate in the UK is 70%. In South Africa, it's not even 30%. The population under the age of 15 in South Africa is almost 30% versus below 20 in the UK. So these two countries could not be any more different. And yet, we have to explain why 39 days. There's one thing that the two countries do have in common, which is the fact that neither fought Omicron very hard. If you look at this chart right here, which measures the policy stringency, in response to Omicron outbreak around the world, you can see UK and South Africa are sort of in the middle of the pack. In fact, they're quite low, certainly for the developed countries. Is it possible the fact that they didn't fight it that hard, could that be their secret weapon? So my hypothesis is that what the UK and South Africa have in common is that by not responding, with draconian measures, they're encouraging their population to reach herd immunity much more quickly. And this is the reason why they peak in just 39 days. If this hypothesis is correct, this would suggest that Omicron is likely to peak much faster in the US than in China, a point that I've made before. But I want to basically show you in this chart because, again, if you look at policy stringency, US versus China, US is much closer to UK and South Africa, whereas China, there's China, So what I'm saying is that I think that the divergence that we can expect between US versus China in terms of how long it would take for Omicron to peak, I think is going to create huge, basically, economic and market divergences too. This is the main reason why I remain of the view that US long-term interest rates are going to be heading higher, whereas in contrast, there's plenty of room for long-term interest rates in China to come down. And this is the reason why I continue to like CNYB and TBT, which gives me exactly, basically, the way to play one off the other. In the US, I think Omicron could peak maybe already at the end of January or the latest by the middle of February. And this is the reason why I continue to like Disney and especially Carnival Cruise Line, both of which doing fairly well. Whereas for China, I'm wary that given Omicron is so contagious, it may actually give China's zero tolerance policy a run for its money. By the way, last 2 weeks, there were concerns in Ningbo, which is the third largest port in the world, about COVID scare and cargo basically disruptions. As concerns about Ningbo ease, this week, the risk of cargo delay is now spreading to Tianjin, which is the largest port in the north, and Shenzhen, of course. This means that the supply chain bottleneck that has been a big problem in 2021 may actually carry forward as long as China does not escape basically COVID yet. The second number I want to talk about is 3.3. So what's 3.3? 3.3 happens to be the latest reading of US rental inflation for primary residents. As you can see on this chart, rental inflation collapsed during COVID, and it made a slow recovery earlier this year. Only in the last 3 months, the number has been accelerating to the upside. But you might ask yourself, why should you care? The reason why you should care is because rent is part of shelter, which in turn represents the single biggest component of the US Consumer Price Index, which accounts for 33%. To put that in perspective, the second largest category, which is commodities less food and energy, that includes like cars, the clothes you put on your back, the computers you basically buy, the iPhones you carry around, all that still does not add up to what you pay for shelter every single month, which is not that surprising, I guess. Central banks, including the Federal Reserve, normally don't care so much about food inflation and energy inflation because these are fairly volatile items. That's why they generally like to talk about and basically focus on the so-called core inflation that exclude food and energy. When we take out food and energy, guess what? Shelter is now a whopping 41% of the index. In other words, unless you can forecast shelter inflation, you haven't got an inkling about what inflation is going to be in 2022. Shelter has two principal components, rent and what's called owner equivalent rent. I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but let me just tell you that actually rent actually is a big driver of owner equivalent rent. So from that point of view, for the purpose of this exercise, we only have to concern ourselves with rent for the most part. So as I said before, if you want to have any sort of like reasonably defended view about the outlook for US core inflation in 2022, you've got to basically have a view about rental inflation. And in other words, you need to have a view about the drivers of rental inflation. So what are the big drivers of rental inflation? Number one, not surprisingly, rental vacancy rate. When vacancy rate is very low, guess what? You're going to see higher rental inflation. Obvious. Okay. Unemployment rate is another big, basically, driver of rental inflation. When unemployment rate is very low, when everybody's got a job, guess what? Most people are probably going to be looking to rent. That's going to basically push up rental inflation. And finally, personal income growth. Right? When income growth is high, people can afford to basically pay more for housing, and that's going to generally be associated with higher growth in rental inflation. When we look at these drivers, you can see here, unemployment rate, is clearly falling. It is set to fall further. I think there's no question the falling unemployment rate is going to keep pushing rental inflation higher. Just look at how good the relationship between rental inflation and unemployment rate over the last 20 years. Well, rental vacancy rate happens to be falling as well, even though it's already at a 20-year low. Meanwhile, during the pandemic, the millennials have finally discovered the pleasure of owning a home. That is also basically driving up housing prices and therefore rental inflation. And there's no question in my mind that low rental vacancy rate is going to keep driving up basically rental inflation. Another big driver of rental inflation is personal income growth. As the economy recovers, as more people getting bigger increase in their salaries and wages, and we know 4 to 5% increase is not uncommon anymore into 2022. I think that is also going to push rental inflation higher. I've estimated a very simple model of rental inflation based on lag unemployment rate, based on lag rental vacancy rate, and lag personal income growth rate. And what basically this chart shows you is that actually the model is already implying that rental inflation should be higher than what's been reported. In fact, this argues that even all else being equal, rental inflation should be moving higher. And yet I know the unemployment rate is going to go down, rental vacancy rate is going to go down more, and then income growth most likely is going to accelerate next year, which means, in my humble opinion, I think rental inflation could easily set a new 2-decade record next year. If I'm right that rental inflation can hit 4.5 or even 5% next year, this is going to scare the living hell out of the Fed, and it's going to kill the stock market, believe me. I'm worried that inflation is going to be a lot stickier to the downside than the market believes right now. By the way, another major driver of U.S. inflation is healthcare inflation. Okay, and healthcare inflation, I suspect, is probably also going to be moving higher next year, especially given that post-COVID, many people are going to go back, with elective surgeries and stuff like that have been postponed for the last 2 years. So many of you guys have written to me saying, oh, wow, the market's already priced in 3 hikes next year, 4 hikes, and Jamie Dimon said they're going to hike basically maybe 6 or 7 times. You know what? I don't give a damn, because at the end of the day, who cares about where short-term interest rates are? The reason is because nobody borrows, okay, at the short end of the curve. I can tell you, even when Fed funds rate go to 2%, your bank account is still going to be earning 0 in both your checking account and your saving account. The only basically people that higher short-term rates going to affect are probably some commercial paper. That's it. What really drives monetary policy transmission are long-term interest rates and long-term real interest rates. And as you can see here, there's a huge divergence between what the Fed thinks long-term real interest rates should be versus what the market thinks. This is a reason why I don't have a gripe about, I don't have an extra grind when it comes to short-term rates. It's long-term rates that I think are still completely underpriced. And that is going to scare the living hell out of the market. What this chart shows you is that the market understands what I'm talking about, at least in terms of what damage, okay, higher real long-term interest rates going to do to all markets. You can see the sensitivity of all other markets to long-term real interest rates in the U.S. right now is pretty much at a 2-year high. You can see this chart here. If long-term interest rates keep going higher, this will be bad for basically NASDAQ. It will be bad for emerging market, basically bonds. It's going to be bad for Bitcoin. It's going to be bad for gold. It's pretty much going to be bad for everything except for cash. This is why I continue to favor cash, as long as I think the market is underestimating how far the Fed will have to go in order to vanquish inflation. The next number I'm going to talk about is the number 30. So what's the significance of the number 30? 30% is the probability that I now attach to a Russian invasion of Ukraine over the next 8 weeks. Now you might say, well, what has made me up my forecast? Well, very little progress came out of the Russia-US talk in Geneva. Washington appears dead set against giving anything at all to Russia's demand for a legal guarantee for, that NATO will not continue to expand, towards Russia, that is including Ukraine, of course, and will not deploy offensive weapons in Ukraine. Putin's big concern is that any missiles launched from Ukraine can hit Moscow in just 5 minutes. By the way, interestingly, the Russian deputy foreign minister issued a veiled warning at the end of the talk this week, suggesting that Russia could send military assets to Cuba and even Venezuela should the Russian oil talk fails. Wow, that's pretty scary if you ask me. Scary, but not that surprising. Americans probably don't remember it this way, but there's no doubt the Cuban crisis was a major victory for Russia. As Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to defuse their tension, guess what? Russia get what they wanted, which was for, Washington to make a pledge not to invade Cuba, and most importantly, for Washington to remove missiles from Turkey. There's no doubt. I have to believe that Putin is thinking Cuban crisis as a playbook for basically what's to come in the next few months. Nobody understands psychological warfare better than Putin. This week, there was a massive cyber attack on Ukrainian government websites, with hackers warning, expecting the worst. Wow. Things are so bad that the Pentagon took a very unusual step this week by accusing Moscow of planning a false flag operation. Let me read you a statement by the spokesperson from Pentagon this Friday. He said it has pre-positioned a group of operatives to conduct what we call a false flag operation, an operation designed to look like an attack on them or Russian-speaking people in Ukraine as an excuse to go in. If that doesn't lead you to think that things are getting really bad, I don't know what will. Whether you like Putin or not, there is no denying the guy is a master tactician, totally calculating and totally rational. And there is no doubt that this could be a now or never moment, because we're still in the middle of winter with 2 months to go, and natural gas storage in Europe is at a 10-year low. Russia's never had such strong leverage over Germany and Europe. And there is no doubt in my mind that Europe is never going to make the same mistake again. In fact, I suspect that next summer comes along, Europe is going to be paying, top dollars in order to fill up their natural gas reserves to the brink in order to avoid putting themselves in the same position. This basically, again, reinforces the point. If Putin is going to act ever, perhaps, it's never been more advantageous for him to act right now. I spent the last 2 weeks watching the Netflix documentary about the Second World War. I was very impressed, by the way, and if you haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend it. But one of the things I came away with is the fact that Putin in many ways resembles Stalin, who viewed himself as a historic figure. And in other words, that like Stalin, Putin's focus is trying to secure Russia's long-term security interests and influence. And for that, he's not going to stop at anything. This is the reason why I do believe that the risk of a Russian invasion is real. And this is also the reason why I remain bullish oil, and I remain very bullish ExxonMobil. And this actually could potentially make you a lot of money. For the same reason why I think a Russian invasion of Ukraine is very bullish for ExxonMobil, I think it's clearly very bearish for the euro. This is the reason why, as much as the euro seems to be moving a little bit higher, I remain very reluctant to close out my short euro dollar position. Thank God I entered the position at a good level. I might hold on for it for a little bit longer. I hardly think it's a coincidence in the same week that the Russian, U.S. talk went nowhere, that North Korea is back in the news in a very big way. just 3 days ago, North Korea test fired 2 ballistic missiles from a rail car. And then on Tuesday last week, North Korea conducted, a hypersonic, missile test, which is the third of such tests in basically since the start of the year. Meanwhile, senior, Iranian officials were in China last week and declared the start of the implementation, stage of the 25-year, cooperation agreement that they signed earlier last year. These are the reasons why I'm very skeptical about the so-called optimism that came out of the latest round of the Iran nuclear negotiation. I think Iran is just buying time. As I've been saying for a long time now, my view is that Russia, Iran, and China have decided that they're better off working together. And by being united, they're much more basically going to be able, in a stronger position to deal with the U.S. And especially given, a series of blunder under the Biden administration that started with the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think these guys, are going to give America a run for its money. We're now in the middle of the earnings season. Obviously, the JP Morgan, earnings weren't great. And for that reason, I still think that stocks are going to be under pressure. This is the reason why going into next week, I'm still going to be basically at the minimum allocation for stocks of 45%. I've raised my basically bond portfolio allocation a little bit higher from 25 to 30%, still very low relative to my benchmark, because I think that if the stock market is going down, it's going to be more difficult for the bonds to basically sell off. And then I'm still going to be very long cash at 25%. Finally, looking at my honest board, if you recall last week I recommended going long, KWEB and CMYB, both of them are actually up. Disney, CCL up, TBF up, ExxonMobil up. Sure, Eurodollar still up. So all in all, doesn't look too bad. Hopefully this will keep going. I can't promise you I'm going to deliver basically profitable trades every single week, but I think, my goal, again, 60% right. That's what I'm aiming for. But so far, it seems that I'm getting ahead of myself. On that note, talk to you guys soon next week.